The scene of angry colonists throwing containers of tea into Boston Harbor is one of the most famous in American history. The Boston Tea Party is widely regarded as a pivotal event in the American Revolution. It was, however, the end of a series of events that brought the 13 American colonies closer to freedom. But what else is there that we need to know about this historic event? Was it really a tea party or something else? Let's find out. So, first things first, what was the Boston Tea Party? The Boston Tea Party is the name given to a protest by Bostonians in the aftermath of the 1773 Tea Act, which authorized the East India Company to market tea directly to its own agents in the colonies, therefore reinforcing its monopoly. Around 100 men entered 3 ships stationed at Griffin's Wharf in Boston Harbor on the evening of December 16, 1773, and destroyed 46 tons of tea belonging to the East India Company. The act of damage was part of a larger sequence of protests throughout Britain's 13 North American colonies, especially in New England, over the preceding decade, in response to rising taxes perceived as illegitimate because colonists were not represented in Britain's Parliament. This resentment is often captured by the phrase, "no taxation without representation." By the early 1770s, there was extensive opposition by organized groups, including the Sons of Liberty, a cross-colony network. The Boston Tea Party, carried out in part by this network's Boston chapter, was one of a series of protests against rising tariffs. The significance of the Boston Tea Party is largely due to Britain's Parliament's resolute response to the protest, which entrenched the event as a watershed moment on the path to revolutionary conflict. On the evening of December 16, 1773, the tea was destroyed. The protest became widely known as early as the next day. In early 1774, Britain's Parliament replied with a series of restrictive statutes against the province of Massachusetts. The crackdown prompted even more unity among the 13 colonies, leading to the formation of the First Continental Congress in September 1774, which was attended by delegates from 12 of the provinces. But why did it actually happen? In the mid-1760s, protests had occurred throughout Britain's 13 American colonies in response to taxes imposed by Britain in the wake of the 7 Years' War, known in the USA more commonly as the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, arose from tensions between France and Great Britain. The two nations were fighting over North American lands, while wars and skirmishes were taking place all over the world. By the end of the war, Britain's national debt had nearly quadrupled from £75 million to £133 million, resulting in more taxes being charged on the country's colonial subjects. The 1765 Stamp Act, which imposed a charge on every piece of paper used in the colonies, from pamphlets to playing cards, was one of the most contentious taxes. Though the measure was revoked the following year due to American colonists' opposition, more divisive taxes followed. The Townshend Act, named after Charles Townshend, then British Chancellor of the Exchequer, imposed charges on imported products such as paint, glass, paper and tea in 1767, among other things. The proceeds from the duties were used to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. This was interpreted as effectively purchasing the loyalty of local officials implementing the taxes. As a result of these acts, colonists banded together to protest taxation. Stamp revenue agents were burned in effigy. Violent scuffles occurred between British forces and colonists, and figures of British authority were targeted by mob actions in some protests, particularly in Boston and New York. Boston was invaded by British forces deployed to execute the Townshend duties beginning in October 1768, inflaming the resentments of colonists who felt their freedoms were being curtailed by Britain's power. The Boston Massacre of 1770, in which 5 colonists were killed by British soldiers, marked a watershed moment in many colonists' perceptions of British authority. By the time the Tea Act was passed in May 1773, the stage was prepared for a conflict between those who supported the British Parliament and others who perceived the increased taxes as an attack on their liberties. The first shipments of East India Company tea arrived in Boston as well as New York, Philadelphia and Charleston in November and December 1773. While the governors of other colonies were able to diffuse tensions by quietly turning the ships around or managing the offloading of the tea into a holding warehouse, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, seen by many Bostonians as an increasingly rigid figure upholding British authority, refused to allow the ships to return to England. He insisted that the tea be unloaded and sold in order for the duties to be collected. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of Boston colonists, many of whom had been roused by the Sons of Liberty, took matters into their own hands in protest of the taxation and fear of an East India Company monopoly on tea. What really happened during the Boston Tea Party? On the evening of December 16, 1773, a significant number of Bostonians assembled in the Old South Conference House for a conference thereafter known as the Body of the People to debate the presence of tea in the harbour. Once it became clear that Governor Hutchinson was adamant that the tea be unloaded, Samuel Adams, a prominent leader in local government and a member of the Sons of Liberty, stood and declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Whether or not Adams' statements were a foreshadowing of what was to come, yells and battle cries could be heard from the meeting house's western end a few minutes later. Soon after, a crowd gathered at Griffin's Wharf, where the three East India Company ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were docked. But what was about to happen was even more shocking. A group of 100 men, possibly as many as 200, divided into three groups. A subgroup of them entered the ships while another patrolled the docks to ensure that nothing interfered with what was about to happen. As they climbed aboard, the guys tossed more than 46 tons of tea over the rails and into the sea. This is where the British Empire strikes back. Instead of reforming their tax policies or accommodating the colonists' demands, the British responded to the incident by passing the Coercive Acts, which shut down Boston's port, changed Massachusetts' charter, effectively shutting down the colony's legislative assembly, and dispatched British troops under General Thomas Gage to occupy Boston. Gage was designated governor, with sweeping powers to appoint local law enforcement, lodge troops in private homes, and restrict locals the right to hold public assemblies. The colonies responded by calling for a Continental Conference. In the autumn of 1774, the First Continental Congress met and approved a widespread boycott of British products. The stage was set for the climactic clash in the American War for Independence between the British and the colonists. But why is it considered an important event in history? The events of the Boston Tea Party immediately sent shockwaves around the colonies and across the Atlantic. John Adams, a Bostonian lawyer and who would soon become a leading patriot and later served as the second president of the fledgling United States of America, did not underestimate the importance of the events at Griffin's Wharf the previous night. The consequences he mentioned were the coercive legislation which inspired the foundation of the Continental Congress. It was the first of its kind, bringing representatives from 12 of the 13 American colonies to Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia to consider the colony's future in the face of what they saw as increasing British hostility. Delegates included Massachusetts Representatives Samuel Adams and John Adams, as well as George Washington, the future Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and the first President of the United States. Delegates met during September and October 1774 to discuss common colonial interests and ways to coordinate resistance to British rule, which was increasingly perceived as aggressive and unsuitable. While independence was not yet firmly on the table in the deliberations of Congress, by late 1774, the colonies had begun to take firmer moves as a group. One of the first decisions was to support the Suffolk Resolves, which were passed in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and directed inhabitants not to obey the so-called Intolerable Acts, to boycott imported British products, and to form a militia. Less than a year after the tea was destroyed, the aftermath of the protest had paved the way for revolution. And that's all for this video, folks. Hope you found this video informative and interesting. If yes, let us know in the comments what your thoughts are on this. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and ring the bell icon to always stay updated with more of such interesting content. Thanks for watching Bite Notes, and see you in the next one.